Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I'm here with my friend Rodrick. Thank you for joining me on the channel, Rodrick.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And before we even begin, talk a little bit about we're gonna start off with Shiva, and we're gonna talk about a lot of spiritual content, everyone. But let's talk a little bit about what you do and some of your plugs, Rodrick, as far as what you've been working on.
Absolutely. So, I'm a podcast hoster. I host an esoteric and occult podcast called The Far Side of Midnight. You can find it on Spotify, Anchor, and Apple Podcasts. And I every single week I have a new guest. I'm working on a series right now called The Lords of Chaos, which is basically a panel of chaos magicians. And I have the Lemic people on there. I have ceremonial magicians, like all kinds of different people. And I read stories occasionally.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so we were talking about Shiva, so I'll give a little bit of my feedback when it comes to Shiva. So Shiva, what I liked about what Paramahansa Yogananda said is that Shiva is usually known as the god of destruction, but actually he's more the element of deconstruction, deconstructing illusion, of deconstructing ego, just like Kali Ma is, which is his consort. Deconstructing those things which hold us back and showing the light of day, and also exposing our soul and spirit past the things that hold us back. For me, Shiva is that old piece of mountain that the carvers got from the mountain and decided that, hey, we're not really carving human shape. We're just going to leave it exactly as it is and worship Shiva through. He is that primal essence. And honestly, for me, he's a step before the spirit beyond creation. He's the closest to this idea of complete and utter oneness that all Vedantists are looking for. So maybe you want to give a little bit of feedback on your experiences or your knowledge of Shiva?
Yeah, for sure. So Shiva, as my understanding, is the supreme self. So everybody has Shiva within themselves. And the whole play, the whole Leela, as they would say in Satanam Dharma, will be to come find yourself, So that's why I know like Shiva is also presented as the Adi Yogi. So like the old, like archetypal yogic master, So I came across Shiva just by learning meditation. I learned meditation several years back from a doctor from India who was a Hindu and just kind of inspired me. Like most people will think, you take a few yoga classes and they have like the Shiva Nataraj dancing cosmic Shiva somewhere in the studio, and that's how we kind of come across it. But for me, it was a little bit different. But yeah, so my understanding of Shiva is the supreme self, and also the supreme God. So Shiva is the God with a big G, I guess, in all worlds, all universes are Shiva. Now, I don't really look at Shiva too much as a chaos destruction god, because in English we translate it to like destruction. But I believe that Shiva is also Shunyata, which is like the emptiness, kind of the void, so sort of like paradoxal. Like that's my understanding of Shiva in a few
Yeah,
words. Yeah.
in a way, he's like the nameless. A lot of yogis will say he's the nothing, but then when we understand it's more like no thing. Like he's not just one thing or identified in relation to one thing. He just is. So
Yes.
a lot of people who follow Shiva, they might sound like atheists sometimes,
Mhm.
but in fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and honestly, a lot of those aspects are what drew me to Kalima. Is because conquering the idea of us being separate, conquering the ego, um, helps the Supreme Self reach its final destination and get rid of all the dust that this world throws upon us. She is the female version of Shiva, and very much a very good positive mirror to Shiva in a way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, Kali. So I was always drawn to Kali Ma. So one thing about which gods or saints or spirits you're drawn to, sometimes it has to do with how you were raised and your relationship with your parents or something like that. So for me, I more idealized my mom, and my mom took care of me more. So I am more comfortable. Well, this is probably one of the facets. This isn't the only facet. I'm more comfortable with looking at the source or the whole as a female deity. That is one of the honestly that's a factor, but it's not the biggest factor. But when we're choosing what we believe, there's some things that go into it. If our parents believe something or if they don't. if our community believes something or they don't, if our friends do or they don't, or if there is some interest within us that leads us based on our own kind of nature in general towards a certain area or a certain god or being. All these things feed into kind of the person that we come and what we look up to. And does that make sense to you?
It does. Yeah, it definitely does.
Do you
As
think
far as like
anything?
the inspiration influence goes, with it, you know.
Do you feel like there's some? Do you feel like there's any part of your life that made you more inclined to work towards this path or that path, or do you feel like it was just completely self-conception from the get-go?
For me, it was like a little bit of both, so because like I wasn't really raised anything too much. I mean, my parents are actually, are pretty much like open, and my mother, she passed away some years ago, but like several years before she passed, she really got into like Yogananda, the teachings of Yogananda and yogic teachings, and it was just like a very open book when it came to like world religions and things like that. So we were never taught that other religions are bad necessarily, So it was kind of pretty much free to explore and things like that. But for me, it was mostly just because I have a very curious mind. Like I always, my whole life, I've been curious to things outside of my culture a lot, but with my culture, but outside of it. Like I'm the guy that would go to like a cultural gathering and then see like Sikhs and Hindus and these people and go like, what's going on with them? Like, what are they doing? So me discovering, Shiva just came from me talking to like a medical doctor from India who taught a meditation class and taking that. And then the deeper and deeper I went, the longer I went with meditation, it just somehow just got me curious to want to learn more about Shiva. And then the connection just sort of happened naturally that way. And then it just sort of clicked and made sense that it turned out, like I didn't know this right away, but it turned out that my ideas for deity or for God, if you will, which I don't really use that word that much, my idea of what God is all Shiva. And I don't mean that in like a fundamentalist way, saying like my God versus your, it's nothing like that. Like Shiva is everyone's God in the whole universe. Because like I said, everyone is Shiva, deep down inside the supreme self as well. It's just a matter of realizing it, even if people don't want to use that name, so my understanding of Shiva as a god is that everything is Shiva, and I don't mean that it's really difficult to talk about sometimes because I don't mean that in a pantheist way, but I don't mean it in a monotheistic way either. It's like maybe somewhere in between, if that makes sense. I don't really have a word. It's not pantheism. It's not panentheism. It's not non-theism. It's just, it can kind of fit into any of those, actually, if you think about it,
Yeah, it's so I'm gonna bring up a reference that I'm not. Have you watched Game of Thrones, by the way? This is leading.
A little bit. I'm not a big TV watcher, but I've watched a little bit of it. Yeah, I know what Game of Thrones is. Yeah.
There's just one God in it that I kind of always understood the source as this, and I call quote unquote God the source, and
Mm-hmm.
then of course I view other gods as pieces of the source in varying degrees, and then pure infinity. You might call Shiva, I'd probably call the source, but when it comes to there's this one it's a fictional god in this show called the many-faced God, and then somebody talks who works for the many-faced God, and then they get to a point in the conversation. He's like, yeah, this many-faced God puts on many different God masks and all human masks. So, but really, everything is just masks for the many-faced God. Does that sound like your conception of Shiva, or?
Yeah, that's about as close as we can get. I mean, I feel as we get as humanity, though, because it's sort of like good luck trying to put a mask on on God. I mean, we do that for our own like sensibilities and our own temperament, so it makes sense. And even within like Shaivism, which I'm not a Shaivite, I wouldn't say I'm a Shaivite, but you have some people that have in India, they have like a very darker kind of aspect of Shiva that they, the agores, they like kind of eat flesh and do all kinds of crazy things. It gets a little bit kind of weird, Then you have like a lot of Orthodox people, and then you have people that are just sort of like in between. You have very casual, but all of it is Shiva, but the only thing that's keeping us from really understanding source or God really is this ego, this part of it. And the ego isn't something that's negative or bad necessarily, but when you start looking into what consciousness actually is, consciousness itself is not, it's not this physical shell. It's not the brain. It's not the wiring in the brain. It's something that's beyond all of that, really, and just a matter of like attuning to what that is. And since Shiva comes from, Shiv, which means unmanifest, when we go into that darkness, that I call it dark matter. I call the dark matter of the universe Shiva as well. When we can connect to that during meditation and during certain magical practices, and when we do that, it ends up being the contradiction. It ends up becoming the opposite. Like in the darkness, there's like light there. There's like knowing when I say light. Does that make any sense? I know kind of.
It's a lot of what you're talking about is non-dualistic, which is Vedanta, and I'm very Vedantic in a lot of my thinking. So a lot of what you're saying makes. When it comes to the Agoris, I think the highest level of Agoris, I remember reading, I think in the autobiography of Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, is that there's the highest level of Agoris and the ones that are like kind of the model that the other Agoris are trying to meet up is trying to achieve is the ones that can literally transform like human flesh into something else and then consume it, or transform different items into something else then consume it. It's not necessarily just eating people at the highest levels,
right. Yeah,
or transforming the matter that's there after the soul is gone and then using that matter no longer in that form. And also, I will say that, when it comes to the curious mind thing you were talking about, many years ago when I was seeking my path, I started going to this Catholic church, and then, after a few services, I walked up to one of the people in charge or whatever. I'm like, hey, I want to become a Catholic. How do I do that? And then he looked at me like, what the what the hell? And then, I noticed when I became part of the whole there's a potluck training thing, or idea discussion, or basically the Catholic Bible discussing different ideas in it, and there's a different pamphlet for every week, and then going to church, and then another day that I went there for actual Bible study. So I noticed that a lot of people were really amazed that I wasn't raised Catholic or my parents weren't Catholic. And they were like, oh, how did you get into Catholicism? And then a part of me realized, I was like, oh, the reason a lot of people are in it is because they've just always been around it. and eventually I remember writing a journal, because back then I was kind of going through getting rid of addiction and stuff. I remember writing in a journal saying, I don't know if what they believe about Jesus is correct, but hey, if it helps me get off when I'm getting off. And then I look back and then I'm like, that's not the way spirituality should go. But yeah, it's, of course I look at Jesus as an avatar at this point, and I'm one of those Hindus that are, there's not a whole lot of Hindus that believe this, and you might not believe this as well, that Jesus Christ was actually an avatar of Shiva. And there's a certain amount of Hindus that believe this. I believe it. But I do believe that Jesus Christ is an avatar of Shiva, but most Hindus believe that Shiva doesn't have avatars. Adi Yogi wasn't necessarily an avatar. But that's just something that I believe about Shiva. Have you ever even heard of that, or is that something that you've encountered before as far as the...
I haven't heard it very much, but I have heard that I've heard of Jesus being a part of Vishnu. I've heard that one. Actually, it's funny because I was talking to a friend today who's a Judeo-Christian, and we had the same conversation about Jesus possibly being some sort of avatar in India. But I have heard it. I haven't heard it that much though. Most Hindus I know, like Western or American Hindus, haven't really mentioned that. They just mentioned Jesus being a very important avatar or an important part of our holy pantheon somewhere. People's holy pantheon, I should say.
It's a little bit obscure. It's definitely a little bit obscure.
Yeah.
But when it comes to so maybe in this last part, while we're nearing the end here, maybe we can talk about how these are spiritual paths we've been talking about. How maybe I can answer this first so that we kind of get the flow going. But how does magic relate to spirituality? So for me, magic is more. So you have the scientist and what he believes. That's what I think about spirituality. But then when you have magic, it's more the tools of experimentation, experimenting with reality and things like that. Because I mean, a lot of even Hindus, like Hindus, I'm Hindu, but I mean, a lot of other Hindus believe that magic is unnecessary. And the worst view is that it's evil, but I don't believe that. But magic to me feels like the tools and rituals that I use to experiment with the fabric of reality. How would you understand magic in relation to your own spiritual nature or what have you?
Okay, so for me, I practice magic the way like a yogi practices kriyas. I told this to people like all the time who ask me about like why do I do magical rituals. So for me, magic is a part of the path to enlightenment or self-realization. That's primarily why I use magic. I would say that's at least 95% of the magical uses. And then the other 5% are practical magic, like manifesting something on a material plane, but, or just some kind of like self-empowerment. But, yeah, I use magic as a tool for self-realization. Yeah. So like for the highest parts of, realization for changing my own awareness and for me understanding myself as a soul on earth in this lifetime, and to also hopefully leave samsara. But before that, it's more about just developing like my awareness enough to, I don't want to say self-deification, but really having that Christ or God realization. So that's why I use magic.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and end this segment. We might make another one or might just talk for a bit, but,
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Rod.
Thank you very much.
Once again, what's your podcast name?
So my podcast is called The Far Side of Midnight, and it is an occult, esoteric, and storytelling podcast to be found on Spotify and Anchor, and also Google Podcasts. I'm on like 6 platforms. I don't know all the names of them. Apple Podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually have a podcast too, but I've kind of fallen off updating it, so I don't really plug it anymore. But yeah, there's a lot of different places. Aaron, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
Thank you.
Who has any questions, comments, concerns, shoot them down in the comment section on YouTube. And we hope all of you have a wonderful day.